I think you're just seeing this like very distributed world now where there isn't really any HQ and everything is, kind of point devices in your employees' hands and, some back-end system, which tends to be Microsoft or Google or Amazon or Salesforce or, Box or these other applications. So I think it's a pretty interesting time. And I think I'm fortunate that I've already been kind of working on these problems and they're just extremely relevant today.
Mobile workforces, cloud applications, and digitalization are changing every aspect of the modern enterprise. And with radical transformation come new business risks. Welcome to Hybrid Identity Protection, the premier podcast for cybersecurity pros charged with defending hybrid identity environments. Presented by Semperis, the pioneers of identity-driven cyber resilience for the hybrid enterprise. And now, here's your host, 15-time Microsoft MVP and Active Directory security expert, Sean Dubey.
Today, I'd like to welcome Ben Johnson to the podcast. Ben has a distinguished history in computer security. Back in the day, he worked for the U.S. intelligence community. Then he co-founded and was CTO of Carbon Black, which was acquired by VMware. Not one to rest on his laurels, now he's co-founder and a CTO of Obsidian Security. It's great to talk to you again, Ben. It's been about a year since we both spoke at the HIP conference in Bentonville, Arkansas.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and thanks for having me on. And that was actually my first time in Arkansas. So I've been to probably 40 something states, not quite 50, but that was actually my first time, and it was a great conference there. So thank you for having me in Arkansas as well.
Yeah, it was my first time too, and as you said, it was a good time. We would have by now met again at HIP New York City, our annual conference. But as obviously nothing in the world is the way we had planned it a few months ago. So here we are kind of chatting about similar topics, just doing it remotely. And actually mentioning that, so, you had talked about, identity security and SAAS security and these items. And I know that all of this has been turned 90 degrees as a result of COVID. So I'm wondering what's on your mind today as far as how that's affecting the areas that you pay attention to.
Yeah, so I think, typically we say that you start in the garage before you create your company, whereas I'm actually sitting in my garage now after the company is up and running. So, it's a bit of a funny twist, unfortunate, global climate that we're all dealing with, and don't mean to make light of that, but I think the way I like to think about things, or we like to think about things, is really, in this future where more and more is cloud. And really by future, I mean now, but you talk to companies out there and they're each kind of saying, hey, look, we're in a cloud first strategy, or we're a cloud forward organization where we're trying to adopt anything that can be put in cloud something, right? Whether it's like infrastructure or SaaS or, platform as a service. You're seeing a lot of organizations that are really trying to take those kinds of applications on and focus more of their team on their core business and less on the, kind of managing data centers and so forth. And so just the kinds of problems that I'm thinking about are really related to security of those systems, threat behavior, risk, all of that. And so when you think about accessing, let's say, Salesforce or GitHub or these different applications that might be extremely business critical now, what first comes to mind? It's access. Like who has accounts, like who can log into to your Salesforce account, or who can log into your GitHub account. And I can certainly talk a lot more in depth about various related topics, but that's essentially what I've been studying or trying to build around the last few years, and we as a team. And so now in this world where everything is remote and maybe working on your home PC, not your corporate PC anymore. Maybe most people have laptops or what have you, and are still on corporate devices. But the point is they're connecting from maybe their home Wi-Fi directly to access customer data, source code, email, of course, those kinds of things. And so I think you're just seeing this like very distributed world now where there isn't really any HQ and everything is kind of point devices in your employees' hands, some back-end system, which tends to be Microsoft or Google or Amazon or Salesforce or Box or these other applications. So I think it's a pretty interesting time, and I think I'm fortunate that I've already been kind of working on these problems, and they're just extremely relevant today.
I think it's interesting that, as this because of the situation we're in, the stampede over literally a course of weeks to more remote work, more cloud focused work, this is certainly a kick in the pants for companies that were considering cloud but taking their time. They hadn't quite decided. And all of a sudden, within a matter of weeks, they're trying to spin this sort of thing up with the resultant. We've both been in the business. The resultant mindset of just get it done. Okay, maybe the security isn't perfect, but we just need to get it done and we need to keep the business running.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put it well. Like people maybe weren't necessarily as embracing of the newer technologies or cloud or SaaS, and have no choice now. And I've even been on calls with CISOs from other organizations, and for example, they had to mail out like 6,000 iPhones and like mail out computers, and you talk to somebody and they have a customer support center in, I don't know, say Philippines or Indonesia or something like that, and the way they've tried to maintain control is everything stays at the corporate site, the corporate location, so nothing in, nothing out, all company owned devices, company controlled networks, appropriate security monitoring, that kind of thing. And they have to let people work from home now, or they're the laws require it, or they're just humans, and they want to make sure people are healthy. And so now these places where they really relied a lot more on maybe physical or perimeter type controls or things like that, there's no choice, and they have to embrace different endpoints, different cloud-based systems, and that kind of thing. So yeah, and then I think you've seen also the huge explosion of Zoom and different video chat type technologies being critical. I mean, we conduct our board meetings now over Zoom, right? And there's lots of other very important meetings. My 4-year-old kid is on with his preschool on Zoom, and so it's really changing just the dynamic of how we communicate, or how we sort of move society forward, business and personal. And then therefore, what do we do about it from security perspective? To your point, it's totally different than it was like a month ago.
Yes, and you say we're all seeing it. Literally just before our conversation, my wife was finishing up a clarinet reed making instructional class via Zoom. She's a clarinet professor. So I think culturally, security is certainly, but just as an aside, I think it's very interesting culturally to see how, even though these capabilities existed 6 months ago, a year ago, and just about the same amount of capabilities, nobody used them, or very few people use them. People like us use them because we tend to be very technology forward. But what this has done is really shoved it much more into the mainstream, and I'll be curious to see how much it swings back. From a security point of view, I'm curious, do you see, in talking to companies, have there been has there been a lot of companies that have basically said, throw all the resources you can at our VPN connection and just scale that up to handle everybody, versus we should be adopting a more of a web services based or identity as a service based approach?
I think you're seeing a mix. So companies that were very much trying to uh, view the cloud as really just an extension of their perimeter and of their on-premise environment, have tried to then sort of lasso around certain cloud applications using VPN or similar types of technologies, where they try to
Mm,
funnel all traffic through a choke point. I think
mm,
I think you've seen some success there. I think you're seeing some companies, it just overwhelms the VPN, or they have to completely upgrade and buy a much more expensive solution, or now all of your employees have to maybe get new devices or install clients and things like that. So I do think there's a set of companies that are trying that. I think some are succeeding, some are not. I think you're also seeing just a lot of companies who are already operating in the sense of, look, employees need to connect directly to, let's say, Office 365 or G Suite, or maybe AWS to do some of their cloud compute, that kind of thing. And so as long as we have a good sense of who has access, and maybe what endpoints they're coming from, or what sort of maybe geographic locations they're coming from, then you at least have a sense of control, and you have an understanding of who has access, who has privileged access, who's actually using these systems, that kind of thing, without really slowing down the worker, right? Because I think to your point, it's like, hey, how quickly can we get up and running in this shift to work from home? And then, okay, now it's time to make sure we have appropriate monitoring and, sort of understanding of employee behavior and that kind of thing. So I think it's both, but I do think you're seeing more and more companies say, look, we can't force like this global workforce to all go through like a VPN or that kind of thing. And if it goes down, then what do we do? So if we can have more sort of trust in, and you use the term identity, if we can have more trust in the sort of identity of people who are trying to access these corporate systems or these business applications, and then again sort of monitor the behavior and the sort of activity that's going on in these systems, then you're seeing companies that can say yes more to their employees, or get their employees up and running faster, but still have a good level of security monitoring and risk reduction.
It's true. In my time spent as an identity architect with a consulting company, I saw as companies, depending on where they are in their journey, and companies that were not so far along would still use Office 365, but you had to access it remotely through a VPN, which of course pretty much hamstrings the sophisticated capabilities that they have if you go to it directly. And as you were saying, more advanced companies, become more comfortable with the idea of that direct access. What do you think in looking at what's going on? What do you think companies are not getting right that they need to be paying attention to right now? What are the things that you see this in it's and you feel, oh my gosh, these people don't understand X, Y, or Z?
Uh, how much time do you have? No, and I joke because I also see a lot of good stuff happening. I think, look, the number one surprise I had in sort of, so just for the listeners, I was very much hardcore endpoint security, right? EDR, continuous recording, malware, that kind of world, and then I shifted over to SaaS and IaaS, like what do attacks look like in Salesforce or Google or these other places. But having said that, my number one surprise in talking to organizations was that very often the security team has no access or very little access to these different business critical applications. So Office 365, security team might have very little access. Maybe they were granted some logs. Maybe they actually have some sort of privileged account to do searching through, through the audits and be able to do some IR and stuff like that. But again, that's a maybe. And then even you get downstream to stuff that really was never under the security purview, like we talked about Zoom. Very few security teams have good kind of monitoring of Zoom or some of these other applications. And so my number one surprise was just that disconnect, and maybe that's on me. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but that disconnect between the application owner in the business, who now may not even be inside of IT, right? They might be like the head of HR might run Workday, or
Mhm.
the head of sales might have brought in
Right.
Salesforce, and IT might have even been kept out of the loop. So I'm not trying to blame any particular group in the organization, but it seems like it's more sort of disparate, more dispersed throughout the organization, and so there isn't that kind of unifying view of like what's going on from a security threat, from an access being granted perspective. And I know you in your identity world and identity architect roles and things like that, like, I mean, a lot of what you try to do is figure out how do you provision all the accounts when new employees start, and how do you sort of maintain an an inventory of access, but then also like how do you monitor it from security and behavioral perspective. So these are all things I'm thinking about, but I think teams that have thought about that and gone down the path of some sort of centralization for provisioning, deprovisioning, and monitoring, I think are in a much better place than the teams where it's still like very business unit specific in terms of who owns each application.
It's an excellent point. I'll use the phrase shadow IT and then I'll put it aside because it's almost more just simply the way business is done right now. And so yeah, as you say, I like the example of the HR team using um, all the different kinds of SaaS based HR applications. And security may have no insight into it at all. Or to use Azure AD for an example, Office 365 for an example, maybe they'll take the activity logs or the sign-in logs and pull them down to an on-premises SIEM system and look at it from the SIEM system, but not up in the actual application itself. Are there
Yeah.
any other? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to comment that I think it really starts with trying to figure out how you get access, like through granting access, through provisioning access, how you maintain a list of privileged users, right? And that's what a lot of compliance and audit care about is who has privileged access, who can make changes, maybe read other documents and things like that. But then, okay, so then how do your employees sign in? Is it through single sign-on and that kind of thing? And when they do that, is it with multi-factor authentication or other protection mechanisms that reduce likelihood of compromise? And then you keep going past that, then it's like, okay, how do you monitor when an employee has done something malicious, or even more likely, how when they've made a mistake, how can you be alerted to that? And they overshare a file, or make a public S3 bucket, or some of these other things that we see a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just teams saying, look, everything that comes in the door, security needs to be on board. They don't necessarily need to be a blocker. And I know CISOs are trying to say yes pretty much all the time and enable things. Security needs to at least know this exists and then have some sort of tap into the telemetry or some sort of monitoring or something, because otherwise they can't do anything if they don't have access to these systems.
So, if you found yourself, and maybe this will be a last question, is if you found yourself having to give advice to an organization, let's say, that has basically beefed up their VPN, but realize it's limited not only in scalability and its security analysis and its vulnerability, and they wanted to take steps to prioritize moving beyond that to a more secure, modern footwork, what would you recommend?
I think one problem security teams have, I've seen this in cloud, I saw this all the time in the endpoint space, is they try to solve the problem for 100% of their surface area. So whether that's 100% of their endpoints or 100% of their employees and accounts or whatever. I was in conversations like 5 years ago where they're like, oh, your endpoint security product only covers 90,000 out of our 100,000 computers. It's like, no. It's like, well, okay, the other 10,000 are like, really old systems that no one's going to cover. So what are you going to, so anyways, I would say that most companies, I'm guessing, you know, I'd be surprised if I'm wrong. Most companies have a large portion of their company that are, kind of the knowledge worker that has a pretty consistent schedule and pretty consistent IT need. And so if you just take the example of people who need to do, office type work in terms of like Microsoft Office, so like spreadsheets and Word docs and PowerPoint and email, and you find people that really that's going to get them pretty much their entire job done. Maybe like Slack or Microsoft Teams or some of these other chat based systems, but basically we're talking about a very consistent need from an IT perspective. Can you carve out a bunch of those users and say, you know what, guys, you can connect directly to Office 365? Like, there's no reason for you to have to go through a VPN just to connect to get your email when that's really all you do. And we should be able to set you up appropriately so you have the appropriate amount of risk, appropriate controls or monitoring, and you're no longer beating on our VPN. Now if you're doing all sorts of very sensitive things and you have to connect to very sensitive production, AWS or Azure, or like running your company's product or things like that, like, okay, maybe you're going through a few more hoops, and that should be a much smaller percentage of your population. So I think my piece of advice would be, can you carve up your population into groups where some of the groups have a very sort of predictable and standard ask, and then they can maybe go directly to again Microsoft or Google or Salesforce or something that gets them most of their job done, and is also going to reduce then all that traffic going through a VPN, or just the maintenance headache of that.
Right. So, in other words, carve it up by use case. Find the low hang, if you pardon the cliche, find the low hanging fruit that you can solve.
Yeah, I think you put it well, and like I said, too many times it's like, well, 100% of our company needs to do this. It's like, no, they don't. Like, like, give your execs, if you're really worried and you're really, maybe you've had some bad malware experiences in the past, give your execs like iPads, which are quite safe. I mean, nothing's perfect, but you're not installing a whole bunch of random binaries and things like that on an iPad, and have them connect to their email through that and stuff like that. And other parts of the population that you can carve off, like you said, by use case or by sort of worker type, and then figure out how to create a good experience for them that maybe reduces the burden on IT.
Right. Right. Yeah. Some maxims never go away. Perfection is the enemy of good, I think, is or some
Yeah.
variation thereof. Right.
Yep.
Well, great. Thanks, Ben. This has been really interesting. I love to hear perspective of someone that's been out and advising companies and, of course, just has a long background and sees trends come and sees trends go. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us on the Hybrid Identity Protection Podcast with Sean Dubey. Be sure to subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen. Visit hipconf.com, that's HIPCONF.com, to learn about upcoming events, view expert presentations, and take part in the conversation.